So now that we've created the login and sign up page for our app, we need to build the app itself. And that's going to start with a list of users for our user to follow. And then we're going to give the option for the user to tap on individual users to follow or unfollow them. All right, so lots to do. So I'm going to start by bringing in a navigation controller, which you'll hopefully remember brings a table view controller with it. And it just helps us work with the navigation within the login area of the app. And to help me test this out, I'm just going to make this the initial view controller. And then let's set up the table on our new root view controller. So I'm going to create a new file, which is going to be, I'll call it user table view controller, and it's a subclass of UI table view controller. Save it there with everything else, and there it is. Before we edit it, let's link it up to our root view controller. So we just click there and then user table view controller. And the other change we need to make is to add the reuse identifier for the prototype cell. Let's just check I've done that right. There we go. Okay, so now let's just edit these lines of code. So I've got a small error in the template code there. Just fix that automatically. And then we'll have one section in our table and 4 rows. And this is the cell for row at index path. So for now, I'll just set up the cell text to be test on each row. And I'll change the identifier to be what I entered. So now we should have our navigation controller appearing by default and our root view controller displaying the table with just 4 lines, 4 rows, each of which will have the word test in them. So let's have a look. There we go. And there's our content. Wonderful. So now that we're sure that that's all working, let's go back and set the initial view controller as the initial view controller. And we'll set up a segue from the view controller to our new navigation controller. And I'm going to call this segue show user table. I'm going to copy that to the clipboard as well, because I'll need it in a moment. So there are 3 points at which we will want to segue from our initial view controller to the user table. And one of them is when sign up is complete. So here, so when the user has successfully signed up, then we're going to want to perform segue with identifier. The identifier is show user table, and the sender is the view controller or self. And we'll need to use self to refer to the view controller there as well. And then the second place that we're going to need to segue is when the user has successfully logged in. So then we'll show the user table. And the third place is to segue if the user is already logged in when they load the app. So pass saves user logins permanently by default. So if the user is already logged in, then we want to jump to the user table, not ask them to log in again. So we do that in the viewDidAppear method. We need to wait till the first view appears and then do the segue. So now we're going to check to see if the user's logged in, and we do that by looking at pfuser.current. So that gives us the current user, and if that's not nil, then we can perform our segue. We don't need that self this time because we're already directly in the view controller, not in a closure. All right, so let's check this out. We should then get the same result that we had before, i.e. it will go straight to that table, but we'll know that that's happening because the user is logged in and therefore the segue is happening. There we go. Wonderful. So we're now ready to display all the users on the table. But to do that, we're going to need some more users. So this is a good opportunity for us to add a logout feature so that we can then log in and add some more users. So let's jump back to main storyboard, and I'm going to add a logout button here to the right of root view controller. So let's add a bar button item to the root view controller, and I actually want it on the right. There we go. And we want this to be a logout button. So let's just change the title to logout. There we go. And then we'll create an action for it. So we don't want view controller, we want user table view controller.swift. So let's make sure that's selected. Actually, I think we might need to do it from the right bar buttons there. There we go. So control drag and then action and log out. There we go. So now let's log the user out. So to log out, we need to do two things. We need to take pfuser, which we can only use once we've imported pass. So let's do that, and then we'll be able to access pfuser.log out. There we go. And we also want to segue. So let's create a segue back from our root view controller to our initial view controller. And then we can jump back over to user table view controller and perform that segue. And I think I'll need to give it a name first. So let's call it logout segue. And then, so the identifier is of course logout segue, and the sender is self. So we should now be able to click on the logout button and firstly log the user out, and secondly jump back to the initial view controller to allow the user to log back in if they want to. So let's just check, make sure that that works okay. Here we go. So now we've got our tests. So if we click log out, that works fine, but we're still under the navigation controller. So we've still got this bar there. So we're going to need to get rid of that. So we can fix that over in viewcontroller.swift. We can do it in the viewDidAppear method. We just switch the navigation bar off, and we can do that using self navigation controller dot navigation bar dot hidden, or is hidden, is equal to true. And then, just to make sure we get the bar back, in the view did appear method here, we'll add the same code, but we'll set is hidden to false. There we go. And while we're here, just before we run the app again, I'm going to switch off the sign up segue so that we can sign up a bunch of people in one go, so that we can get lots of new users to our app. So here we go. We've already done test. So I'm going to put a bunch of sign-ups. Let's have Rob, excellent. Kirsten, Tommy, and of course, Ralphie. Brilliant. Now we'll put the segue back in and just check that everything's still working. We'll have one more sign up and then we should be able to sign that user in properly. Oh, in fact, we're already signed up. Great. So we're going to be logged in as Ralphie here. Let's actually just log out to make sure that logout works properly now. And there we go. So we lose the navigation bar. And then let's have one more test. We'll have a sign up as Mike. And there we go. Now we're in. I've just noticed that this is called root view controller, which is not really what we want. So let's just rename that to something more sensible. So tap on root view controller there, and then I'll call it the user table. There we go. Or maybe just users. Great. Okay. So now we're all set up. It's a matter of downloading all of the information from our parse server about the users and then displaying those to our current user. So we're going to do that by having a variable containing all the usernames, which will initially be an empty string. We'll have a couple of other variables there, but that's all we need for now. And then in the viewDidLoad method, we'll update that array. And we'll do that by creating a query. But this one's going to be a PF user query. So we're going to be querying users this time. And we want to find all the users. So let's run that query. Query.find objects in background with a block, and double click on the block. We're going to get hopefully an array of objects, so I'll just call that objects, and we may or may not get an error message. Okay, so this object is going to be all of our users. So I'm going to see if we can get it. So if let users equal objects. And in fact, let's do a quick check for an error before that. So if error is not nil, then we'll just print it to the console. Else, we'll try and get those users. Then if we can, we're going to attempt to loop through them. Now remember, these are initially going to be returned as objects. So I'm going to look for objects in users, and then we'll need to attempt to cast them to PF users. So we'll take our object and attempt to cast it to a PF user. So we're doing quite a few things there. We're checking to see if the objects array exists. If it does, we're looping through it to get all the objects. And then we're checking to see if those individual objects can be casted as PF users. And if they are, we can refer to them as a PF user using the user variable. So what I want to do is update the usernames array with those users. So then I can just use usernames dot append, and the new element I want to add is user dot username, which I can use because I know that user is a PF user, so I can safely force unwrap that. And I'll need to use self there because we're in a closure. All right, so now I should have all of the users in my usernames array. So let's reload the table view data. Oh, and don't forget self there to access the table view. But we will need to update the table code. So number of sections is still 1. Number of rows in the section is just going to be usernames.count. And then here we're going to set the text label text to usernames and index path dot row. Okay, let's take a look. So we should now find, instead of test, 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 we get the names of the users on the system. Let's take a look. And there we go. So there's all of our usernames. Notice we've also got this blank one at the top there, which isn't ideal. That's because we had this initial blank username there. So what I'll do is I'll just take our code just before we start looping through the objects, and then take self.usernames and remove all. There we go. And at the same time, I'm just going to jump over to my past dashboard and delete the 2 test ones. There we go. So we've got nicer, cleaner data there. So let's just check that again. We should now have just our active users. And there we go. Wonderful. One small change I'd like to make here is to get rid of the second part of the email address. So we've got something that looks a little bit nicer. Another way of doing this would be to ask the users for a specific username if you don't want their whole email address appearing there. But we're going to take a bit of a shortcut and just get the first part of the username. And we can do that, if you'll remember, by creating a quick array, which is going to be user.username dot components separated by string, and then that string is going to be the @ symbol, and then here we're going to have username array 0. So let's just check that that's all okay. It should split the username by the @ symbol, and then username array 0 will give us everything before the first @ symbol, but there'll only be one because it's an email address. There we go. Much better. But as I say, if you want to display some kind of username, you'll want to probably ask that separately to the email address rather than just using the first part, because otherwise people will have the same username. But that's a good enough shortcut for now. We're also going to need the user IDs, because we're going to need to be able to refer to people uniquely. And so I'm going to save those as well, initially as just an array with a single string in. And then here we're going to take user IDs and we're going to append the user dot object ID. And again, we know that every user will have a unique ID, so we can force unwrap that as well. We won't use that straight away, but we'll definitely be using that later on. Okay, so that was the easy bit, believe it or not. Now it's the tricky bit. We need to have a way of working out whether a user is following another user or not. And I'm actually going to do that by creating a class over in the Parse dashboard. Not necessarily because we need to, but just because it's a bit clearer. And sometimes when you're doing something quite complicated, like working out whether users are following other users, it's easier to set it up in the dashboard rather than let it get created automatically in the app. So I'm going to call this a followers class. Oops, I'll try and spell that right. Create the class. And it's going to be fairly straightforward. We're going to have a following column and a follower column. So for each relationship of someone following someone else, we're going to have a follower and a following. And of course, we're going to put the user IDs in there so that we can get that uniquely. So what we want is for our user to be able to tap on one of the users in the table and then follow them. So let's set that up. Down here, we want did select row at index path. We don't appear to have it there, so we'll need to add it in ourselves. Not a problem. So did select row at index path. There it is. So this means that the user has tapped on one of the rows. So in the first case, we want to do two things here. We want to set the row as checked so that the user sees a little tick next to that user showing them that they followed them. And then we actually want to set the following relationship up in our followers class. So let's add the tick first. We do that by getting the cell that's been clicked on, which we can do by accessing the table view and then cell for row at index path. And the index path is kindly provided to us by this method there. And then we just set cell dot accessory type, and we set that equal to UI table view cell accessory type. There it is. Dot checkmark. So that will give that a nice tick. And then we want to set up our following relationship. So we'll set up a variable called following, which is going to be a PF object with a class name of followers. So the class that we just created here. And we want to set two attributes here. So we'll set the follower. Remember, that's the person who's doing the following. So that's going to be our current user. So we get that from pfuser.current.objectID. And then we're also going to set following, and that's going to be the user ID of the person that was clicked on. So we can get that from user IDs and then index path dot row. And then finally, we can save that in the background. And we don't actually even need a callback for this one because we don't really need to know when it's done. We can just do it happily in the background there. And yeah, let's make that a let. Okay, so obviously that's very much a first stage. We want to allow the user to unfollow people later on as well, but for now, let's just take a look and see if that works as is. So here we go, let's try and follow Kirsten. So we get that nice tick for a start, that looks promising. Let's now jump over and refresh the data browser. And there we go. So we can see we've got this following relationship set up. Wonderful. We do need a way though of keeping track of who is following who within the app, or at least we need to know if our user is following particular user. So to do that, I'm going to create an array called isFollowing, and this is going to be a dictionary with a string and a boolean. So initially it's going to be an empty string and true, but what we're going to have here ongoingly is an ID of the user and then a true or false to say whether that user is being followed or not. Okay, so now when we get the users to display on the table, we're going to do another query. So this time we're going to query the followers class and we're going to add a where key. So a where key allows us to find specific types of data, just like we did in core data earlier on in the course. So we're going to look for where the follower is equal to our user. So that's the pfuser dot current, and then we want their username, so object ID. And we also want to query whether the person that they're following is equal to the current person. So that is the user dot object ID. I think we'll need to force unwrap both of those. And then we'll do our search, so run our query. So we'll find objects in background with a block. And again, we may get an array of objects. We may get an error message. I'm not going to check for an error this time. All I'm going to do is see if we can get some objects, and if that's the case, we'll set isFollowing for user.objectID to be true. So that means that we've found a relationship in the followers class. So they are following, and if not, we'll set is following for that particular user to be false. Okay, we're getting there. So now we're going to update the table load. So here, so on the initial table load, we're going to check to see whether the user is being followed or not. And if they are, we'll give them a check mark. And we can check that now very easily by checking is following and then the user ID. So that's user IDs and index path dot row. So if that's true, then we're going to give it a check mark, which we do using cell accessory type is equal to UI table view cell accessory type dot check mark. And we'll just need to force unwrap that there. We know it will have a value because we're setting an is following value to either true or false for all of our object IDs. Okay, there are a few small things we need to change before we can run that. So first off, I'm going to make sure that we clear user IDs and also is following when the data comes back. And we also need to make sure that this table reload happens only at the very end when we've got all the data that we need. Otherwise we're going to get a crash because is following might not have all the data for all the user IDs. So I'm going to do a check here to see if is following dot count is equal to usernames dot count, i.e. do we have all the data for is following, and if we do, then let's reload the data. All right, so let's take a look. We should now find that when the page is loaded, we see the correct data and the appropriate usernames are ticked. Notice I have ticked a few others in the meantime, so there may be 2 or 3 selected. There we go. Wonderful. So now those ones are all ticked, which is great. I don't know if you noticed while it was loading, we did have a tick appearing, which looked a bit strange. We can get rid of that, I think, by just changing is following to false. Okay, so now we're fairly close to achieving what we wanted to do in this video. There's a couple of things that remain. The first is, of course, being able to unfollow people. So we'll get that sorted first. And then finally, we shouldn't show the current user their details on here because they don't need to be able to follow themselves. So the last thing we'll do in this video is remove the current user from this list. All right, first off though, let's see how we can unfollow users. So the following process is done here. So what we're really going to need to do is a check at this point to see if the user is being followed. And in fact, we can use the same code here. So if is following user IDs index path.row, then we want to unfollow them. And if not, we want to follow them, which is what we've got happening at the moment. So first off, let's take the cell outside there, because we're going to need that both ways round. Okay, and then so if they're already following, we want to unfollow them. So let's take our cell accessory type and set it to none. That will get rid of the tick. And then we need to remove the association on pass. And we can do that with a query. So we'll get a PF query with a class name of followers. And then we want to find the same association that we did before. So we want the follower to be the current user. So pf user.current object ID, and we want another where key to find out who they're following, and that is going to be the user ID and index path dot row. And yep, lots of unwrapping there, but we should be fairly safe with all of that. We know that the user's logged in, and we know that a user always has an object ID. So then we run our query. So find objects in background with a block. And we're used to doing this now. So we won't check for an error. We'll just check if objects can be unwrapped. And if it can, we'll loop through it. And we'll take each object and delete in the background. So we should only expect one, but this covers us just in case more than one of the same following appears in the database somehow. Speaking of which, we should also update our isFollowing. So we should set isFollowing equal to false, because they're now no longer following that user. And down here, we'll do the opposite. So they're now following the user. So we'll set isFollowing for that particular user ID to be true. Okay, so now we should be able to select and deselect users, and that will result in the appropriate following and unfollowing relationships being created. So let's have a look. That all looks fairly promising. So I've done lots of unfollowing there, and I should end up just with two relationships, Tommy and Ralphie. So let's have a look. In followers, we just have those two relationships. And I'll assume those are both correct. We'll see on the next load anyway. Brilliant. So we're nearly there. The final thing for this lecture is to not show the current user, who I believe is Mike at the bottom there, I think. But that's easy enough to do. So when we're looping through our users, all we need to do is check to see if the user object ID is equal to the current user's ID. In fact, we'll check to see that it's not equal to. And if that's the case, then we want to do all of this. Just get it in the right place. Where are we? There we go. So now it will only add all the following variables, etc., if that user is not the current user. So now we should get exactly the same result as before, but I think without Mike. Let's find out. And there we go. So just to be reasonably sure that everything's working, I'll add a couple of ticks there so that we're following everyone. And then we'll jump over and check on the data browser, and we're up to 4 relationships there. Wonderful. So I hope you managed to follow all of that. That's pretty complicated stuff. But now we have an active users table. And again, this could be used as the basis of any kind of social following app, really, that we have a list of all of the users and we're able to follow them or unfollow them at will. So now we're going to add a commonly used feature for these sort of apps, and that is pull to refresh. So we're going to allow the user to pull down on the table, and then that will update the user list, and they'll be able to see any changes that they've made or that have been made for them in the meantime. We'll do that in the next video.